The flower is the reproductive organ in flowering plants. So now let's take a look at its structure. This is the stigma and it receives pollen grains. Next, we have the style, which supports the stigma and makes sure it stands upright. Next, we have the ovary. The ovary contains ovules inside, and the ovule contains female gametes inside. Now, all of this is supported by the receptacle, which is ultimately supported by the flower stalk. Now, this is the male part of the flower. So the male part, first of all, it consists of the anther. The anther produces pollen grains, which contains the male gametes inside. Next, we have the filament, which supports the anther. Now, for the plants, it's important to attract insects. So this is the nectary, and it produces nectar, which gives a very pleasant smell for the flower and for bees to collect honey. Now, finally, this is the petal. So the petal in insect-pollinated flowers are large and conspicuous, which helps to attract insects. Pollination refers to the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. In self-pollination, pollen grains from the same flower or flower of the same plant will pollinate the stigma. In cross-pollination, pollen grains from a different plant of the same species will transfer its pollen grain to the stigma of another flower. Now let's take a look at the differences between insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. Insect-pollinated flowers have bigger and more colorful petals. They also have a pleasant scent. They also have nectaries which produce that pleasant scent and the nectar. The anthers in insect-pollinated flowers are inside the flower, while then wind-pollinated flowers are outside the flower. The pollen grains for insect-pollinated flowers are larger, more sticky, and they come in less numbers, while for wind-pollinated it's the opposite. Also, for the stigma in insect-pollinated flowers, the stigma is inside the flower. It is broad and has a sticky surface. While for wind-pollinated flowers, it is often outside the flower. It is long and feathery for catching the pollen grains transferred by the wind. In order for sexual reproduction to happen, fertilization must take place. This happens when the pollen grains can land on the stigma. The pollen grain that has landed on the stigma will develop a pollen tube. This pollen tube will digest the tissues on the style, and as it continues to develop, the male gametes will be transferred along the pollen tube. The pollen tube will continue to grow into the ovary and then finally into the ovule, where the male gamete and the female gamete can meet. The two of them will fuse together, where fertilization finally takes place. This will produce the zygote, which will then become an embryo. After fertilization, the ovary will become the fruit. So the ovary wall will become the fruit wall, and the ovule will become the seed. The female gamete, or the ovum, will become the embryo. So the embryo is the part that will later on develop into a plant. The sepal, stamen, petals, stigma, and style, these parts will wither, dry up, and then fall off. The fruit that is produced will then help protect and disperse the seed. It will be able to carry the seed to other places. This is done by explosion, or by wind, by water, or when animals feed on the fruits and then disperse the seed somewhere else. It is important that the seed can be dispersed to a far-away place. First off, this can help reduce overcrowding and competition between the parent and the daughter. You don't want the parent and the child to be competing over the same resources. This also allows the plant to colonize new areas. Furthermore, it helps the offspring to escape from pests or diseases that may be present in the original habitat. If there is a disease in the original habitat and the seed is dispersed, then the new plant will probably not be affected by the diseases happening in the original area.